Andy Austin here with the next chapter from The Rainbow Machine, Tales from a Neurolinguist Journal by Andrew T. Austin. That's me. This chapter is the Eluding Resistance chapter. Now, resistance was a concept largely popularized by Sigmund Freud. I'm going to read you actually from the Wikipedia page. I might as well go straight for a reference point. Resistance in psychoanalysis refers to oppositional behavior when an individual's conscious defenses of the ego are threatened by an external source. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalytical theory, developed his concept of resistance when he worked with patients who suddenly developed uncooperative behaviors during sessions of talk therapy. He reasoned that an individual that is suffering from a psychological affliction, which Freud believed to be derived from the presence of suppressed, illicit, or unwanted thoughts, may inadvertently attempt to impede any attempt to confront a subconsciously perceived threat. This would be for the purpose of inhibiting the revelation of any repressed information from within the unconscious mind. That is a whole lot of presupposition then, and a whole lot of projection on, I think, on the psychoanalytical theory's point of view. One of the main explanations for resistance in therapy, and I've seen this repeated actually in other areas of therapeutic intervention, whether it be in hospital care, in general medicine, or in my own sort of client work arena, it's because they got primary and secondary gains. The client doesn't want to change. They cling to the disease, they cling to the disorder, because the problem they have brings them benefits. When I was a student nurse back in late 80s, early 90s, so I was a student between 89 and 92, we were taught extensively about secondary gains and why do people smoke and why won't people stop smoking? Well, they get benefit from it. We learned about the sick role, that people adopt the sick role and will stay in the sick role because they want to get the benefits of being sick. They don't have to go to work. They get alleviated of responsibilities. They get income coming from the government and so forth. So there's a lot of benefits from adopting the sick role. And so we were encouraged to think holistically, and that nothing was ever what it seemed to be. That if somebody was ill and they weren't recovering, there might be a primary and secondary gain coming from that illness. And this also meant we couldn't believe much of what people told us, because we had to look beyond that and understand that the chronic patient, the person who has chronic pain, might be benefiting from that chronicity. Now, that was something I was strongly schooled in, and it's still heavily thought of as a school of thought in nursing and medicine. That is still a very powerful thing. And we even have the same thing when people look at the homeless, that we blame homeless people for their predicament. They have reasons for being homeless, and that people are only homeless through choice. And that is a very common thing that people seem to express. Not just in the UK, I've heard this expressed overseas as well. Now, as a result, this is a sort of an institutional form of victim blaming. And I don't want to go too far the other way, where we then say no one is ever not responsible for themselves, and everyone else is to blame for an individual's predicament because of social constructivist theory and so forth. I don't want to get into that. But I do think this notion of secondary gains that is often projected onto people is an error. You see, my theory is this: if we are going to work with individuals who appear to have secondary gains, addressing the secondary gains doesn't produce much benefit. I've certainly not seen it be beneficial. Often when people raise the whole notion of secondary gains to a person with a long-term or chronic issue, that person either takes flight, they get angry, they get defensive, or they become very argumentative, because it's quite offensive for them to be hearing this from another person. Now, for those who know me, I have a chronic long-term health issue. I have abandoned the notion of seeing general practitioners anymore. There is no value to me doing that, simply because I'm now in that position, and I can see it. I can see it in their faces. They don't even have to say it. I can see it. Now, I've never benefited financially or any other way that I can picture from having this long-term issue. But because of my long-term issue, has been resistant to a lot of the nonsense treatments that they have offered. Some of the standard things I've been offered, it's like, what? Are you insane? There's no way I would do that. Well, now I'm refusing treatment. I'm now the patient who is repeatedly going back to general practice and refusing the treatment that is offered, and is also argumentative. How does that look to somebody who's been schooled in secondary gain psychology? So there's a hidden agenda. They will project out that I have a hidden agenda, and I'm playing a game myself in doing this, and that's obviously not what's happening. Now, this is a very, very common thing. Maybe when people appear to be benefiting from their problem, it's not a secondary gain. Maybe in order to live with the problem, in order to make life bearable and actually a little bit more tolerable, people start to build comfort inside the problem. So the problem isn't quite as bad as it would otherwise be. And sometimes by getting comfort inside it, we can live better. But to somebody who's schooled in what started off as Freudian psychoanalytical theory, and if you just read some of Freud's theories, it might leave you with a few questions about the sanity of the man himself. I mean, just insane, some of this stuff. I'm not a fan, as you could probably tell. But by having people thinking, they're secondary gains, and that what you're benefiting here isn't a survival response, it is the reason why you have the problem in the first place. So this is causative. I have the problem because I get the benefits, rather than I have the problem and now I'm going to start to find benefit within it because I have to live. And this is one of those things that people just don't seem to understand. So now, if we tackle secondary gains, which I think is not necessarily the secondary gain thing is not inherently within the behavior itself. It is a frame that is placed upon the behavior by the therapist or medical practitioner. I don't think the gain is within the problem. The gain is within the frame of perception of the problem. But by tackling those things or attacking those things, we don't necessarily get any change. But if we change the frame entirely and we say, okay, you do appear to be benefiting from this, and I'm not surprised, to be honest. You've had to live with this for so long, it's no wonder you have found ways of dealing with this in an effective way. We now have a whole different framework by which to work with people. So when working with resistant patients or resistant clients in this way, this is the frame I like to use. Rather than take an accusatory frame that says, essentially implies, you're faking this in order to benefit. What we can say is, you have a long-term problem and you've built comfort within that problem, and that's a good start because it's got you this far. Now let's see what else we can do. We have a much greater connection with that person and that person's issue. So part of this whole thing about resistance that's come out of Freudianism is the framing of that resistance, I believe, is the very thing that's likely to promote resistance itself. So I see you having long-term problems, and I go, so, do you have any benefits from this particular problem? Let's look at how this problem benefits you. That might start to set something up in terms of the resistance. Now, if I just go through, again, on this Wikipedia page I've got here, on resistance in Freudianism, and we have various mechanisms of it. There's repression, and there's transference, and there's ego resistance, and id resistance, and Freud's, and what else? Super ego resistance, and all sorts of other stuff. The resistance takes on a whole model, and now the notion of resistance in therapy itself becomes the object of obsession, really, by the coach or therapist. Maybe, just maybe, the coach and therapist isn't very good, and that actually the resistance that's being displayed is because the coach and therapist isn't very good. I mean, let's face it, there are people out there who've bought into this model that says if you tap on energy points on the body, if you tap, you will realign all of your problems. All the energies get realigned in. It doesn't matter what client or what problem that client has who comes through the door of that therapist, tap your face, tap your face. There are NLPs out there who've learned NLP, their memory of what they learn has reduced down, their ability to replicate what they've learned is reduced down even more, and they will do a swish pattern or 6-step reframe on absolutely everything that comes through the door. There are hypnotherapists out there who have the script for the depression, they have the script for anxiety. It's the same thing for everyone that comes through the door. But when the client doesn't play along with their own particular game plan, then there's something wrong with the client. They're being resistant, and maybe they're clinging to the problem. Or maybe Bandler was right in that there are no resistant patients, there are only resistant therapists who lack the flexibility to pay attention to what's coming through. And the irony is, I think that some of the most resistant coaches and therapists of all will be the NLPers, who, despite having learned those things, have reduced down the entire model just to a set of techniques and are unable to model out the problem they have in front of them, and instead just impose a list of techniques. My evidence for this, I've seen it firsthand. I have been around practice groups a lot over the years, and just have a look on the NLP forums online. It is horrifying what people write on there. When somebody says, I've got a client coming next week with such and such a problem. Will the swish pattern do it? Should I 6-step reframe it? And then lots of people who know neither the coach or the client and know nothing about the client will then come out with their favorite techniques, which is you should do this technique or this technique. And they're operating from a theoretical perspective rather than first-hand experience. So resistance is much more than Freud would say, and I think it's much more than what the NLP model would say, which is there is no resistant clients, there are only resistant or inflexible, to be more correct, inflexible therapists. There are many more things going on, because sometimes the resistance might be nothing more than the client doesn't like the therapist, or worse, the therapist doesn't like the client but is unable to communicate that to themselves. And because they can't even be honest with themselves, they're now unable to be honest with the client, and so there is an inbuilt incongruency in the communication that then emerges from there. I'm interested in what other people think of this whole notion of resistance, and especially when it comes to primary and secondary gains. I'm going to throw this out there just to make my case. I don't believe there are secondary gains. I think that is a frame and a model created by psychology to essentially victim blame a lot of the patients coming through the door. And that when we start looking at things a lot closer, things don't stand up to the scrutiny, and that's often what appears to be secondary gains, or most of the time, they're not. They're just the ways the person copes with living with their difficulties. Now, the difficulties, of course, may not be what is being offered verbally and described by the client. So I might come to you and say, well, I'm horribly depressed and I need help with my depression. But the real problem is I'm from a low social economic background. I live in an environment that smells of violence and urine, and there's graffiti everywhere, and there's gangs, and there's very little law and order infrastructure, and there's very little job opportunities in the region. And I might have a landlord that is overcharging and failing to deliver on property maintenance. There may be lack of soundproofing between me and the house next door. Just start there. But my problem comes to you, and when I come to you, I say, well, my problem is depression. And you don't know the social economic background that I've come from. And so now you might now learn that from my depression, I'm getting some benefits. I might even have a partner living with me who now has caring allowance, so they get an increased benefit from the government. And I go, well, you see, you don't have to go to work, you're getting paid all this money. That may be a frame we can place on there, but actually we're not seeing the bigger picture. And that's what I think is going on with resistance. When we have resistance that is occurring between client and therapist, we're failing to see the bigger picture, and instead we revert to psychological terms and diagnostic labels by which we can blame the client. Use the comment section below. Love to hear your thoughts.